At 26, Milton Hershey stood in Lancaster with empty pockets and a reputation for failure. Two bankruptcies, family loans burned, uncles who refused to see him. He'd walked away from Philadelphia beaten, then crawled back from New York. Even worse, chocolate meant nothing to him yet. It was expensive, reserved for people with money he'd never known. But soon enough, it would become the one item capable of making his name worldwide famous. Learning a trade nobody respected. Milton Hershey's first job came at 14, when his father placed him as an apprentice printer for Sam Ernst's German-English newspaper. The work was repetitive, the owner was quick-tempered, and Hershey hated every minute. After months of struggling with the machinery and patience, he sabotaged the printing press by throwing his hat into it. He was fired immediately. His mother didn't punish him. She understood the printer job had been his father's terrible idea, not something her son actually wanted to do. Fanny Hershey searched for something that matched her son's abilities and found Joseph Royer's confectionery in Lancaster, where candy and ice cream were made by hand using recipes passed down through generations. Measurements were approximate. Formulas were rarely written. Knowledge moved quietly from one person to another. It was a calm job in a better environment. But there were still problems. Royer didn't trust young Milton with actual candy making at first. Hershey washed dishes, delivered orders, and worked the counter. Fanny intervened again, offering to pay Royer directly to teach her son the trade properly. Royer agreed. Hershey learned how sugar behaved under heat, how timing affected texture, how ingredients could stretch without ruining quality. He paid attention to sourcing, pricing, and customer reactions to small changes. Over 4 years, he absorbed mechanics that most people dismissed as trivial. His father called confectionery women's work. Hershey ignored him. By the time his apprenticeship ended, he possessed something new, a repeatable skill tied to actual demand. Knowing how to make candy was one thing. Learning to survive selling it would break him twice before he figured it out. Two failures that nearly finished him. In 1876, Hershey opened his first shop in Philadelphia during the Centennial International Exhibition. Crowds flooded the city. Foot traffic was enormous. He stocked candy, ice cream, fruits, and nuts, working alongside his mother and aunt to meet demand. For a while, sales held, and things looked good. When the exhibition ended, customers vanished. Fixed costs remained. Sugar prices climbed. Hershey borrowed repeatedly from relatives. Certain persistence would balance things out. Instead, pressure mounted. He worked himself into exhaustion, then illness. At 24, with no support left and debt piling up, he filed for bankruptcy. The failure followed him to Denver, New Orleans, Chicago, and New York. He worked in other people's shops, absorbing techniques, watching operations. In New York, he opened another business focused on caramels made with fresh milk, a method he'd learned in Denver. Early sales showed promise. Then competition tightened. Larger companies with better funding crowded him out. Expenses outpaced revenue. By 1886, he failed again. This time, family members stopped responding to requests. Uncles who'd once loaned him money refused. One told him he was no different from his father, just drifting between ideas without results. Hershey returned to Lancaster, unable to afford shipping for his belongings. Relying on former acquaintances to store what remained, he was 26 and penniless. Two ventures collapsed. Credit dried up, trust eroded. From the outside, Hershey looked unreliable, another small operator who confused effort with strategy. What didn't show was what he'd carried back from Denver, a detail about fresh milk and caramels that he'd never forgotten. The comeback nobody expected. Milton Hershey returned to Lancaster without announcing plans or renting a shopfront. He worked with what remained, making small batches of candy by hand and selling them directly, sometimes from a basket, sometimes through informal channels. The scale was modest because it had to be. Years earlier in Denver, he'd noticed a local candy shop using fresh milk and caramels instead of paraffin, which was standard. The texture came out smoother, the flavor softer. The caramels lasted longer without spoiling. Back in Lancaster, Hershey returned to that idea, adjusting recipes through repetition until results stayed consistent. Customers noticed. Orders became regular without advertising. He secured a small loan from William Lebkitcher, a former associate who believed in the candy more than the man's reputation. With that money, Hershey rented limited space and began producing caramels full-time, reinvesting every dollar into equipment and ingredients while keeping personal expenses minimal. Then, a British importer sampled Hershey's caramels and was struck by their flavor and durability. The importer placed a large order, conditional on the shipment surviving the journey to England in good condition. The order could establish Hershey's business, Fulfilling it required money he didn't have. Hershey approached a local bank for an additional loan, already carrying debt and lacking collateral. The bank declined. The cashier, however, had watched Hershey work. He'd seen the setup, the efficiency, the product. Against standard practice, he'd personally guaranteed the loan. It was the lucky break that Hershey needed. Production began immediately. Hershey hired temporary help and worked alongside them to complete the order on time. Days passed without a word. Payment was due. Failure would end everything before it started. Then a letter arrived with a check for £500 inside. It covered the loans, cleared the debts, and left room to continue. For the first time, Hershey's persistence had converted into momentum. Success that made him restless. By the early 1890s, the Lancaster Caramel Company grew steadily on consistent demand and a product that traveled well. Orders came from across the United States and Europe. New equipment was added. Factories expanded. At its peak, the company employed over 1,000 workers and generated more than $1 million annually. Remarkable for someone who'd been bankrupt twice. From the outside, the story looked complete. Hershey became a respected Lancaster figure. His debts were settled. His reputation was repaired. He could have stayed exactly where he was and lived comfortably. Yet success created a problem. Caramels required constant attention. Sugar prices fluctuated. Competition increased as other manufacturers copied the process. Hershey paid attention to markets the way he always had. He noticed European demand for chocolate accelerating among ordinary consumers, not just the wealthy. In the United States, chocolate remained expensive and inconsistent, often imported, poorly stored, and treated as an indulgence rather than a staple. Hershey studied that gap. In 1893, he attended the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Among displays of industrial machinery, one demonstration stood out: a German chocolatier showcasing equipment capable of rolling and refining chocolate on a scale Hershey had never seen. The process suggested repeatability beyond novelty production. He purchased the machinery and shipped it to Lancaster. No announcement, no immediate strategy shift. He began experimenting quietly, producing small batches alongside his caramel operation. Dozens of varieties followed. Most were imperfect, some unsellable. He treated it as research because he finally had the time and money to experiment. The more time spent refining chocolate, the more restless he became with caramels. The margins felt capped. The product felt temporary. Chocolate seemed unfinished as a category, especially in America. Hershey believed it could be produced consistently, stored longer, and sold at prices ordinary families could afford. Therefore, expanding the consumer base. Advisors urged caution. Employees depended on the caramel company. They didn't want to switch to something that had no track record of working. Selling a profitable business to chase an uncertain process looked reckless. Hershey listened, then continued his experiments. The decision forming in his mind carried risk beyond earlier failures. This time, he wasn't trying to recover from loss. He was considering walking away from success. Building chocolate from scratch. In 1900, Milton Hershey sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for $1 million. An extraordinary amount of money at that time. It was a clean exit from a business that finally worked. The money gave him freedom but removed the safety net he'd spent over a decade building. Everything now depended on chocolate. European manufacturers, particularly in Switzerland, had solved parts of the process, but their methods were closely guarded and difficult to replicate at scale. Hershey was essentially back at square one. The difference this time was that he had the money to back himself. Hershey chose farmland in Derry Township, close to dairy supply and water, and started building a factory designed for volume rather than novelty. The location puzzled observers. It was rural, isolated, and far from major cities. Hershey wanted control over inputs, transport, and labor. Milk arrived fresh. Power and water stayed consistent. The factory ran continuously. The problem was milk itself. When added to chocolate, it burned easily, spoiled quickly, and resisted a uniform texture. Milk had been what saved his caramel business, and now it looked set to ruin his chocolate business. Hershey and his team tested batch after batch, adjusting temperatures and ratios, discarding failures without hesitation. They tried every kind of milk imaginable. Progress came slowly. What finally worked wasn't powdered milk, which produced flat results, but condensed milk, carefully heated and blended to preserve flavor while extending shelf life. That process changed chocolate economics, and what happened next changed Hershey forever. 5 cents changed America. For the first time, milk chocolate could be produced in large quantities, stored for months, and sold at a price that didn't restrict it to the wealthy. Hershey priced his milk chocolate bars at 5 cents. The price was intentional, placing chocolate within reach of working families, children, and everyday shoppers. He knew pricing it any higher would restrict sales. It wasn't about selling one bar for a lot of money. He wanted to sell as many bars as possible, and that meant doing it at a price accessible to almost everyone. Distribution followed quickly. The bars appeared in general stores, not specialty shops. They were consistent. They tasted the same week after week. By 1906, sales crossed $1 million annually. Products expanded. Hershey's Kisses in 1907, almond bars in 1908, but focus remained narrow. Hershey didn't market chocolate as an indulgence. He positioned it as nourishment, tied to fresh milk and rural production. It's hard to wrap your head around that now, but customers loved it. Advertising emphasized reliability and availability rather than luxury. Chocolate stopped being occasional. The scale that followed was unprecedented. The factory expanded, output multiplied. Chocolate moved from a specialty item to a routine purchase. The business grew into millions, then far beyond, laying the groundwork for a company eventually valued in the tens of billions. The transformation came from treating chocolate as infrastructure rather than ornament, and Hershey was only beginning to decide what that wealth should be used for. Wealth with a different purpose. As the chocolate business expanded, Milton Hershey's attention moved beyond production targets. He'd seen what instability did to families and how quickly opportunity vanished when work disappeared. With the factory growing in a rural area, he began shaping the environment around it as part of the business itself. Hershey purchased large tracts of farmland in Derry Township and built a town from the ground up. Housing came first, followed by schools, churches, and transportation. Streets were planned deliberately. Utilities were modern. Public spaces were treated as necessities. Workers were encouraged to live nearby but not controlled the way other industrial towns operated. Wages were steady, living conditions clean. He'd created a place where people actually wanted to live and work because it was enjoyable, not because they were forced to. The town grew alongside the factory. Electricity arrived early. So did public transportation, medical facilities, and recreational spaces. Hershey believed productivity was connected to well-being, a view that separated him from many industrialists of his era. During economic downturns, including the Great Depression, construction continued. Projects started not only because they kept people employed, but because the product was still wanted. Chocolate had become a welcome treat during harsh times, and people didn't want to stop consuming it. Hershey's approach to wealth was also shaped by personal history. He and his wife, Catherine, were unable to have children. In 1909, they founded the Hershey Industrial School for orphaned boys, designed to provide food, shelter, education, and practical training. After Catherine died in 1915, Hershey formalized his commitment to the school. In 1918, he transferred the majority of his personal fortune and control of the company into a trust to support the school. The decision shocked contemporaries. He retained enough to operate comfortably, but relinquished ownership on a scale rarely seen. He measured success differently. One is only happy in proportion as he makes others feel happy, Hershey said, a statement that guided decisions more than public recognition. Wealth to him was functional, meant to stabilize systems, not accumulate unused, and this principle made sure his company thrived over decades of instability, turning Hershey's name into a brand people recognized and loved. What Hershey became after Hershey. Milton Hershey died in 1945. But the structure he put in place ensured the company would continue operating as he intended. Control remained tied to the school he founded. The business kept its focus narrow, resisting the temptation to dilute identity while steadily expanding reach. Over time, the Hershey Company grew into one of the largest chocolate manufacturers in the world. Today, its products are sold in more than 60 countries. The company earns tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue and is valued at well over $40 billion on the stock market. It owns some of the most recognizable names in confectionery, and its factories produce millions of chocolate products every day. What makes the financial structure unusual is who benefits. A significant portion of the company's voting power is still controlled by the Milton Hershey School Trust. The success of the business directly funds education, housing, and long-term support for thousands of children. As the company grows, so does the school's ability to operate without relying on donations or public funding. The business has adapted to changing markets, expanding beyond chocolate into snacks and other food categories while maintaining profitability and scale. The core remains intact. Mass-produced chocolate, sold at accessible prices, built on systems designed to last. Milton Hershey never described his work in terms of legacy. He focused on function. He built processes that outlived him and tied wealth to responsibility in a way that was difficult to undo. A poor farm kid who once struggled to afford food ended up shaping how chocolate was made, sold, and consumed, while redirecting much of that success toward people who started with even less. And the result is still visible today in store aisles and institutions that continue offering it because he planned for them to. Do you think turning chocolate into billions was the real achievement? Or was it what he decided those billions were for? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.